Hello, brothers and sisters. I want again to welcome all of you to this other new lesson. Remember, in the last 7 lessons, we discussed about different specialized interpreting situations. In this lesson, of course, it's a new lesson, a new topic. I want us to focus on the basic modes of interpreting. The basic modes of interpreting. And when it comes to a basic mode of interpreting, we'll talk about the 4 types of mode of interpreting. So of course, we'll discuss each of them in the next lessons at length. So the first one, we'll discuss about simultaneous interpretation. We'll also talk about consecutive interpretation, whispered interpretation, negotiation interpretation. Those 4, we'll discuss them at large. And remember, they are the 4 basic mode of interpreting. So take note that many members of the public fail, of course, to appreciate that interpreting is an incredible complex profession. So, of course, with some even using the term synonymously with translation. In reality, remember that taking the person or the speaker's spoken word and rendering it in another language in a taxing affair, putting enormous pressure on interpreters to match the speaker's tonal and of course emotional register without recourse to the dictionaries and glossaries is something very unfair. So I want to let the public know that interpreting is something that takes your time, something that requires your passion, because interpretation should not be confused with translation. Those 2 terms are different. Interpretation is purely use of a spoken language to a sign language, or from a signed language to a spoken language. So the 2 exercise requires passion and requires your time, a lot of thinking, among other things. So this is not something that someone will take it in a light note. Interpreting or interpretation requires a lot of your time. So take note also that interpreting is also taxing from logistical standpoint. Of course, event organizers, debate chairs, and government departments have long struggled over the question of how best to promote dialogue in situations where delegates require an intermediary or is the best to prolong, of course, the conversation twofold. So the interpreter has, of course, a chance to repeat each statement one by one, or should they be asked to interpret simultaneously as the respective parties speak. So this is not something that is very easy, that you simultaneously interpret as the 2 people or the 2 parties exchange a conversation. It's something that requires a lot of thinking and passion. So the answer, of course, is that different approaches suit different problems. So that's why we are going to discuss the 4 basic modes of interpretation. So not all of them are applicable at given events. So remember that the interpreting needs of course, the Kenyan Parliament are a long way removed from those of an automotive or those one from an industry conference or a business conference. For example, while a hospital has very different requirements to work in, of course, as a team, So meaning to say that different interpreting situations, the way we have discussed, might demand for a specific basic mode of interpreting. So as a result, there are several styles of interpreting in active use today. There are so many of them, but for us, for our case, of course, we are going to focus on 4 different basic modes of interpreting. So a language professional who intends to interpret in a multiple fields, of course, needs to be faced with all of those modes. You need to know how to interpret with all those 4 modes we are going to talk about. So remember, I've said that we have different types of interpreters. And for the sign language interpreters, you don't need to know all these things. But for those specialized interpreters, like legal interpreters, medical interpreters, among other things, you have to know what we are talking about so that you are able to give out your interpretation the way it is expected to be performed. So some of which, of course, some of this method or basic mode may call for very different skills and aptitudes than others, of course. So meaning to say that we have to be very careful with the type of events and the type of the mode of interpreting we are going to choose. But for us interpreters who are professional, we have to know all those 4 basic modes of interpretation. So to find out a little more about the various techniques used by today's interpreters, including, of course, the situations in which they are most often used, as well as their, of course, unique advantages and drawbacks, then read on the following that we are going to discuss. Make sure that you go through them again and again. The one we are going to mention, we are going to discuss the 4 techniques used as basic modes for interpreting. Remember that for legal, for medical, or for professional interpreters, you need to know all these 4 basic modes of interpreting. So make sure you get to know the things we are talking about so that you are able to interpret in all situations that, of course, you'll be tasked to. See you in the next lesson.